back to the Pattern Scout YouTube channel. If you are new here, my name is Casey and I am the designer behind Pattern Scout. I design sewing patterns, and today I am doing a sew along for my newest pattern release, the Flora tank and dress. This pattern comes in 3 options: a tank top version, a mini dress version, and a midi length version. Now, if you have been here for a little while, you will probably have seen me wearing this dress over and over again and talking about it over and over again because I love this dress. I made my first one, the one that I'm wearing, last summer and have worn the heck out of it. So I knew I needed to turn it into a pattern, and the pattern includes bust cup options. So I have a B cup, a C cup, and a D cup included across all of the size range. There are also 2 strap options. So there is a thin spaghetti strap, and then there is a wider strap that will kind of give you a little bit more bra-friendly option for this dress. And the straps are tied at the shoulders, so you can kind of customize the fit. You could also make this really easily with the straps permanently attached and not do a tie strap. So that is definitely an option if you prefer that. Today I'm going to be making version C, so that's going to be the midi length dress, the longest version, and I'm also going to be making the wide straps. This is a very beginner friendly pattern, I think. It's very simple. It's basically a rectangle with tucks across the bodice to create some shaping around the bodice and some darts. And the top of the bodice is finished with bias bindings. The fabrics that I recommend for a dress like this are going to be lightweight and flowy fabrics, non-stretch woven fabrics such as rayon challis, which is what this dress is made out of. It's really nice and lightweight. A lyocell twill, which is what I'm going to be using for the dress in this video. Linen is going to be excellent for a dress like this and going to be so nice and comfortable, especially for summer. You could do cotton linen blends, or lightweight cottons would be really nice. So you have a lot of options, but I would definitely keep it very lightweight and flowy. Now in this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to make continuous bias tape for finishing the neckline of the dress. If you don't want to make your own bias tape, you can also buy bias tapes. You're just going to need approximately 2 yards of single fold bias tape that is a 1/2 inch wide for its finished width. I put a link down in the description to the pattern so that you can go get it for yourself if you haven't already. And you'll also find all of the other information that you need, such as sizing and yardage, on the pattern listing. So be sure to check out that link below. And if you are new to PDF patterns, please be sure to check out this video. I have a video here on YouTube for how to buy, download, print, and assemble PDF patterns. So be sure to check that out, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you if you're brand new to this type of thing. And if you have already bought the pattern, thank you so much for supporting my business. I really do appreciate it, and thank you for being here and watching my videos. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. This lyocell twill that I'm using has been sitting for a little while in a folded lump, so I'm going to give it a quick press to get all the wrinkles out. Working with fabric that is wrinkle-free is going to give us the best result and make sure that all of our tucks are nice and straight. For the print at home version of this pattern, I do offer the option to only print the first few pages and then measure down for the length of the dress that you want, depending on the version that you sew. So I'm just doing that here. I'm going to measure down for the midi length version, but if you prefer to print the entire pattern and have all of the sheets printed, that's totally fine too. I do provide that option. There's also a measurement to clip a notch in the side seam for the slit on the midi length version of this dress. So you'd only need to do it for version C if you're making the longer version. And then I just want to make sure that I go around and clip all of the notches. There are several notches across the top of the bodice for the tucks that we're going to be sewing, so you want to make sure that you just clip the ones for your size. When I mark my dart locations, I like to just fold out the dart and then trace the dart directly onto the fabric. I usually use my chalk for this, but the chalk is going to brush away really easily, and I want to mark this in a way that'll stay because we're going to be putting the darts in after we sew all of these tucks. So I've decided to use a heat-soluble pen to mark my dart location so that once I have the darts sewn in, I can just go over them with the iron and the marks will disappear from the fabric. Now we just need to mark the location on the front and the back bodice for where we want these tucks to stop. On the back bodice, it's down about 5.5 inches from the top of the back bodice. For the front bodice, it is about 9 inches from the top of the bodice. So I'll do the same thing, just measuring from the top and marking a line all the way across the bodice. Now we can start sewing all of the tucks across the bodice pieces. It helps to have a nice big flat surface where you can lay out your fabric, so either on a big table like this or on the floor is going to be ideal, just so that you can lay it out and get it nice and straight. So for the first tuck, I'm going to find the first 2 notches at the top of the bodice and match those up, right sides together. And I'm just going to put a little pin there to hold it in place. Then I just want to measure along that fold to the side seam to make sure that the fold is very straight before pressing it in place. For this project, I'm going to be using Gutermann all-purpose thread, and I'll be using a Schmetz universal sewing machine needle in the size 70-10, which I think will work well for this type of fabric. For each of the tucks, I'll be starting at the top of the bodice and sewing straight down to the line that I marked on the bodice. And each of the tucks has a 7/8 inch seam allowance, so I'm sewing it exactly 7/8 inch from the edge of that fold that I pressed for the tuck. Then I'll just press the tuck toward the side seam of the bodice. To sew the second tuck, I'm going to flip the bodice again wrong side down so that I can fold it right sides together. I'll find the next 2 notches at the top of the bodice, pin those together the same way I did for the first one. And then again, I'm going to kind of straighten out that fold, make sure it gets nice and neat, and I will measure the edge of the fold to the seam that I just sewed for the first tuck. So again, I'm just making sure that that's nice and even all the way down so I can get it very straight. This measurement is going to vary slightly depending on the size that you sew, but you just want to make sure that it's consistent down the length of each tuck. Then I'll just press the fold in place the same way that I did for the first one and sew the second tuck again with a 7/8 inch seam allowance. And I'll continue this process of folding and measuring and pressing and sewing and pressing and repeating until I have all of the tucks sewn across the bodice. There are a total of 6 tucks across the front bodice and across the back bodice. And once I finish sewing all the tucks, I will make sure that all of them are pressed toward the side seam. So I'll have 3 tucks that are pressed toward the right side seam and 3 that are pressed toward the left side seam. Once I have all of the tucks sewn into the front bodice, I can sew the darts. So I'm just matching up the dart legs at the side seam, right sides together, and folding the dart in half, and I'll make sure to match up those lines that I drew on either side, and I just pin it in place. Then I'll start at the side seam and sew to the dart point to sew the dart. As I reach the dart point, I like to kind of curve my stitching toward the dart point as I taper it to the dart point so that it gives a little bit of curvature over the bust. And instead of back stitching for my darts, I'm going to be tying a knot just for a little bit neater finish, and then I can just trim the threads. I'll just press the darts in the downward position. I've also heard that if you have a larger bust, sometimes it can look a little bit better to press them upward, like toward the top of the bodice. So you can press them in the direction that works best for you. I usually press them down. With the front bodice prepped, now we can work on sewing the tucks into the back bodice. If you want a little bit speedier method for sewing the tucks, and if you're feeling extra confident, you can just go through and fold each of the tucks, press them in place, and measure between the folds for each of these tucks, and do this all at once so that you're not running back and forth between your ironing surface and your sewing machine. And I do like this method. It's a little bit quicker, but I only recommend this method if you feel pretty confident with working with the fabric. If you're kind of new to sewing, I would do it the way that I showed before. But once we have all of the folds pressed, we can just sew each of the folds back to back, so we don't have to keep running back and forth. So this definitely speeds up this process quite a bit. And, you know, if you're feeling good, I say go for it. And once again, we'll just press all of the tucks toward the side seam. So you'll have 3 pointing to one side seam and 3 pointing to the opposite side seam. Here's how my speed tucks look from the exterior and from the interior of the garment. I think they turned out pretty darn nice. Once we have all of the tucks sewn in, we also want to do a row of stay stitching at the top of the bodice. This is the front bodice. I also did the same thing for the back bodice. It'll also kind of help tack down those tucks at the top. For versions B and C, the two dress versions, there is an inseam pocket. So I'm aligning the top of the pocket with a little notch in the side seam, and I'm aligning the pocket right sides together with the bodice. Then also the pocket to the side seam with the 5/8 inch seam allowance. I also cleaned up the edge of the pocket where it's sewn to the bodice with my serger, just along that pocket edge, because that will be exposed on the interior of the garment once it's finished. You can also zigzag stitch this to finish it, just to kind of help it keep from fraying. Then I'll press the pocket away from the bodice and understitch the pocket to the seam allowance. Once all of the pocket pieces are attached to the front and the back bodice, I'm going to align the front and back bodice wrong sides together. We are doing a French seam to finish the side seams of this dress. So we're going to start with the pieces wrong sides together. My first seam is going to be 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to sew down the side seam. When I get to the top of the pocket, I'll stop and pivot to sew around the pocket edge, and then stop and pivot again to sew down the rest of the side seam, maintaining that 3/8 inch seam allowance the entire way. When I get to the notch where the top of the slit is going to be on the side seam at the bottom of the dress, I want to stop at that notch, and then I'm going to pivot my stitching and stitch about 1/4 inch at a 45-degree angle down toward the interior of the dress. I'm just doing like a little kind of leg off of the stitching here, which will make a little bit more sense once we finish the side seam at this French seam. Then I just want to clip into the seam allowance right at that point where I pivoted and turned into the side seam. So I'm clipping all the way to the stitching here, not through it, just to that tip of the stitching. And then I will grade my seam allowances above the slit down to half. So they'll probably be a little bit less than 1/4 inch wide for the seam allowance after trimming. I also want to clip into the corners where the pocket attaches to the side seam. This is going to kind of free up that side seam and make it easier to turn this later. And I'll do that for both the bottom and the top of the pocket. And here you can see where I had clipped into the seam allowance earlier and then trimmed the seam allowance above. And I want to leave that seam allowance intact at the slit opening because that'll be our fold allowance for finishing the slit. Before I turn this wrong side out to finish the second part of the French seam, I just want to press open the seam allowance. This is going to make it a little bit easier to get that nice crisp fold once I kind of press everything for the second seam. So now I'm turning this wrong side out, and I'm going to press all of the edges of that seam allowance nice and crisp. So I'm basically pressing this right sides together now. I also want to take my time around the pocket, get all of those edges pressed out really nice and flat. At the top of the slit where I had that little 45-degree stitch, I've turned it out nice and flat and kind of poked out that little corner there, and also made sure that that seam allowance can lay nice and flat now that I have this turned wrong side out. So you can see there, I've got the edge that's a little bit more finished at that 45-degree angle, and then the seam allowance is still kind of hanging out there. Then I will sew the second seam for the French seam at 1/4 inch down the side seam around the pocket into the top of the slit. And at the top of the slit, I just want to go down maybe about 1/2 inch below where I stopped the stitching before. And you can see here that my stitching grazes right up against that little 45-degree stitch that I did. Now I can hem that slit opening. I'm just doing a double folded kind of baby hem for this. I also folded out the very top here. It's a little bit hard to see, apologies for the framing, but I did like a little 45-degree turn at the top of the slit opening so that I can kind of fold that over and conceal all of those raw edges. And I did this for both sides of that slit opening. Then starting at the bottom of one side of the slit opening, I just top stitched that fold in place, working my way up to the French seam, pivoting around the top, and then coming down the other side. I also want to do a little top stitching across the top of that slit opening just to make sure that it doesn't pull apart with wear. Now we're ready to work on the shoulder ties. I am doing the wide ties for my dress in today's video. The same steps apply for the narrow ties. So I'm just folding in the edges by 3/8 inch to the wrong side on both sides of the long edges of the ties. Then I'm also going to fold in one of the short edges by 3/8 inch as well. Then I'll just fold this in half wrong sides together and press it in place, aligning those folded edges that I just pressed. Once I have all of this pressed in place, I'm just going to sew around 3 edges of the strap. I didn't film this, sorry, but I'll sew around all 3 edges of the strap, leaving one raw edge. I've basted that raw edge to the top of the bodice, and I've aligned the edge of the strap with the first pleat on the front bodice, and I'll do that for both sides of the front bodice. On the back bodice, I aligned the strap between the first 2 pleats. So this worked a little bit better for me personally with, being a little bit more bra friendly. It hid my straps pretty well, but this is also a good point to try on the dress and kind of, decide where you want to put these straps. So we can set the dress aside for now. We're going to work on our bias tape. So the top of the dress is going to be finished with a bias binding. This is a little tutorial within a tutorial on how to make bias binding, continuous bias binding, which kind of mystified me for a really long time, I'll be honest, until I watched Paula Jean's video over on the June Made YouTube channel. I'll link it down below. She did a really great job of explaining how to do this as well. I'm going to show you how to make it here as well, but definitely go check out her channel. She has some really great tips as well. We'll start with a 10 inch by 10 inch square, and you want to get this nice and straight and then cut it in half on the diagonal, so on the bias. Then you'll align those 2 pieces right sides together along one of the short edges with 3/8 inch of that little triangle overhanging at the edge. And then we're going to sew this together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance open and then lay the fabric wrong side facing up and align it really nice and straight. It helps to have a gridded cutting mat for this step just to make sure you get everything nice and straight. So I'm just marking lines vertically on the long direction at 1.5 inches apart each. And I'll have a little bit of extra left over at the edge. I'm just going to trim that off so that I have perfectly spaced 1.5 inch lines. I'll also want to mark the seam allowance at the short end. So I'll do this on both sides of the short ends, and I'm doing again a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And I accidentally marked one of my lines at the wrong location, so I'm just using my iron to kind of make that disappear. With all of my lines marked on the wrong side of fabric, I want to turn this right side facing up. And I'm essentially going to fold this right sides together, but I need to align the rows that I marked with the opposite side. This is going to be offset by 1 row. So I'm starting in the center and I'm pinning right through where the seam allowance crosses over one of those lines and matching it up with the opposite side. Again, I'm offsetting the rows a little bit, so it's gonna be weird here. Like, this is not really super intuitive. But once I get all of those rows pinned together, I'm going to sew along that seam allowance at 3/8 inch. And you'll have a little bit of excess at the points here that are overhanging the edge. And once we lay this flat, we can see that our seam allowance is now diagonal. So what we've done here is basically created a cylinder that is also a spiral. And if we cut along the lines that we drew, we can create a continuous strip of bias tape, which is, it's kind of magical. This is like one of those magical sewing techniques that is so fun once you figure out how to do it. So again, shout out to Paula Jean for showing me the way. My 10 inch square of fabric created approximately 60 inches of bias tape, which is kind of amazing. It's such a great scrap buster and you can do so much with so little fabric. I'm using my bias tape maker to create single fold bias tape. I'm using an 18mm bias tape maker to do this. So I'm just going to pull the tape through this bias tape maker to create those folds, pressing the folds in place along the entire length of my bias tape. You can do this without a bias tape maker as well. You'll just fold in the edges of the bias tape toward the center and press those in place. Once I have all of the bias tape pressed, I am going to press it again, this time with steam, and I'm stretching the bias tape. This is going to help our bias tape lay nice and flat once we have it installed. And I know it seems counterintuitive, but I'm telling you, this is like one of the best tips I ever learned for bias tape. This is going to make the bias tape slightly more narrow, which is totally fine. You just want to stretch it as far as you can, like really get aggressive with it, and do this for all of the bias tape before we install it. I'll be starting my bias tape at the side seam, so I've just opened up the bias tape here, aligned it with the top of the bodice, and folded over the end. So I've got the bias tape right sides together with the top of the bodice, and I'll use the top fold as my seam allowance guide. I prefer not to pin my bias tape around the entire area that I'm sewing it to. I like to kind of guide it as I go under the sewing machine needle. I think this helps avoid any kind of bunches or gathers in the bias tape. And once I get back to that side seam where I started, I'll just overlap the bias tape and trim the excess off. I also want to trim the seam allowance in half for the bias tape, just to make sure that I don't have any kind of raw, funky edges hanging out once I finish this. And then I'll turn the bias tape toward the interior of the bodice and press it in place. Then I will edge stitch the bias tape to the interior of the bodice to finish the top of the bodice, making sure to keep those straps out of the way while I do this. Then I'll give it a good press to get everything nice and flat. And I also have a blog post that's actually been one of my most popular blog posts, but I have a blog post on how to do bias binding, some extra tips and tricks, so I'll link that down below as well. Okay, we are getting so close to finishing this dress. I'm going to do a wide hem on the bottom of the dress, so I'm pressing a 1/2 inch fold and then pressing an inch fold and then top stitching that in place. Now I can finish the shoulder ties. So I've just tried on the dress and I'm pinning it where I think I want the shoulder ties to be tied. I'll measure that location from the back and the front bodice on both sides just to make sure that they're even, and then I will stitch the shoulder straps, the ties together at that location. Then I can just tie the straps in a bow, and doing it this way will make sure that, you know, if the ties come untied, they won't fall off your body, and our dress is finished. So much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and I hope you love this dress. I have loved wearing this and I'm very excited to finally have a pattern to share with you guys. I know I've been talking about it for almost a year. So I apologize for talking about it for so long, but it's finally here. So happy it's out there. And I hope you love it. If you do make this dress, let us know in the comments down below, and also let me know which version is your favorite. If you enjoyed today's video and you'd like to see more from me, please be sure to subscribe and hit the little bell icon. That way you'll be notified when I release new videos in the future. I share all sorts of sewing content here, occasionally a few other things, but mostly sewing content. And yeah, I'm glad you're here. Okay, I think that is all I have for you today. I will see you in the next video. Bye.